And I think the public opinion polls on China have shown us very nuanced and sophisticated new realities about China in the world. And as we have written in the report, China 2025, the coming year will proven to be pivotal in testing Beijing's resilience and adaptability as it confronts of an increasingly hostile geopolitical environment. I think it's fair to say that uncertainties will be the defining feature for China's foreign policy in 2025. So our next panel, last panel, led by our senior fellow on national security and foreign policy, Lyle, will help us navigate with his first-class panelists of such uncertainty and explore some new political realities of China's foreign policy in 2025. Over to you, Lyle.
Great, thanks, Jing. So I have the honor of being moderating the last panel of the night on foreign policy. My name is Lyle Morris. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for China Analysis. It's my great pleasure to welcome our panel of 4 distinguished CCA experts on Chinese foreign and economic policy to the stage to talk about what we can expect from China in 2025 in the foreign policy space. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip their bios because you have those in front of you, but let me just welcome Pascale, Sungmin, Brandon, and Philippe to the stage. Thank you for joining me tonight. So when I read the China 2025 report, one word that comes to mind is uncertainty. Uncertainty over the direction that Xi is taking China, uncertainty over China's economy, and uncertainty over U.S.-China relations under Donald Trump for the next 4 years. So with this backdrop in mind, let me start first on the trade and technology front. And Pascale, if I could start with you. So, trade and technology is clearly going to be a centerpiece of Trump in the next 4 years. How will this affect relations with the West and with China and the U.S.? I think is an important question. You've written a lot on critical minerals, de-risking, economic security in the context of China and its relations with the West. You're also recently, I must plug this book, China's Vulnerability Paradox, How China Transformed Global Commodity Markets. Great book. So given your expertise in this topic, my question to you first is, how should we expect questions about economic security, de-risking, to shift on both sides of the Pacific following the return of Donald Trump to the U.S. presidency? And specifically, if you can talk a little bit in the context of critical minerals.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. I'm very, very pleased to be here. Such wonderful, terrific event and day. So what I want to do in the sort of 5 minutes or so, 7 minutes that I have, I want to do 3 things. So first, just to offer a couple of reflections on the broader backdrop to this evolving situation, then answer the question on critical minerals in 4 parts, and then end with some suggestion of a way forward, so a different way to think about the problem. So a couple words on the broader picture. I think that right now we're facing a world where the 2 largest economies have become so deeply entangled in a deep sort of resonance. If I was as well versed in dialectical materialism as Dr. Rudd is, I might call it a dialectic, that we're not able to analyze them in isolation anymore. And I think this is actually a very recent phenomenon. That wasn't true 20 years ago. And this security dilemma, economic security dilemma that has developed, I think goes deeper than the sort of perceptions of each other's actions like we find in a traditional security dilemma. I think that it now finds its roots in domestic dynamics, which amplify it on both sides of the Pacific. Fractures in China's and the US's own systems, which have come to their own sort of an end of a golden era. Hyper, globalized neoliberalism in the US and reform and opening up in China. And this is leading to dynamics of, securitization, nationalist, populist tendencies, and has given rise to leaders in both cases that have less appetite for progressive reform and are perhaps less likely to back down. So this is sort of the backdrop. Now, what about critical minerals? So in the multiple discussions that I've had with my Chinese colleagues, including on a recent China trip, it's very obvious that these dynamics are present in that space. And we're actually doing mirroring research in China and in the US and Canada, on those questions in some ways. Except in this case, China's had decades head start in thinking about resources from a security perspective. It's something that we've only started to do, I would argue, very seriously over the past 5 years, perhaps. But these efforts on the Chinese side stem from a deep sentiment of vulnerability, actually, and continued reliance on imports, which is still true for the majority of its upstream supplies. So what, about Lizzie and others have talked about the recent announcements on export controls. What about those? I think that they're new in many ways, as Lizzie alluded to. Precedents were way more opportunistic and had more ambiguity to them. This December 3rd announcement is obviously really well coordinated and a direct reaction, retaliation. Second, however, I think we should pay attention to the wording of the December 3rd export control, so CURB's announcement, which say that in principle, the exports shall not be permitted. And I think that this hints at the fact that it does in fact play the role of signaling and in advance of Trump's coming back in January. The third thing I would say is that, I alluded to the fact that the US-China relationship is deeply interactive. Well, there are unintended consequences to export controls as a tool, as the US is discovering in the case of its own measures against China. And so for China to use these tools will also accelerate Western countries' incentives to diversify. It also has an impact on prices. So we've seen antimony prices rise 230% over the past year. Well, that's not good for all Chinese stakeholders. And many people are asking right now, would China impose the same sort of controls on broader classes of commodities like nickel or cobalt or lithium? Well, the only thing I would say, nothing is impossible, but low prices in these minerals have served Chinese interests very well. And in fact, increasing prices would solve a lot of problems for Western firms who have had difficulty in investing in those minerals for obvious reasons. So the last thing I would say on the critical minerals question for China is that it may be a good thing if China doesn't follow this to its extreme conclusion, as the US and the West, I would argue, is not ready to face the music on this front. We've relied on open markets for decades, and we are only now just realizing that this paradigm is ill-adapted to the pursuit of economic security. So just briefly, before I turn to the last comment I will say on the way forward, the return of Trump on this file will mean continued attention, I would argue, for sure. And he may want to, bring down regulatory hurdles domestically. He may be less interested in an ESG lens. But his de-emphasizing of the climate change angle and his tariff-based logic, maybe, as well as his aversion to multilateral sort of solutions, may be counterproductive to the objective of resilience in critical minerals chain. So I would argue that China's dominance is likely to be a reality we have to work with in the foreseeable future. So if I may offer an idea going forward, and I'll close with that. I think that we suffer from a case of cognitive dissonance and under-specified objectives in this area. In other words, we're trying to do too much or the wrong things. So how can we think about the problem differently? Instead of trying to de-risk, so to remove the risk from the entirety of the critical mineral supply chain, which I think is an unrealistic objective, we may think instead along the lines of asymmetric resilience. or targeted dominance. Focusing on efforts at mapping carefully different critical mineral supply chains and identifying particular nodes or market layers where we can actually obtain leverage, given China's deep enmeshment and remaining import and export vulnerabilities. The goal here would be to build, and I'm keen to hear your reactions to this, a balance akin to MAD for nuclear deterrence, something that I could call mutually assured resilience, for example, between the West and China. And this would seek to increase, actually, the sentiment of security on both sides, instead of doing it on one side, which I think has negative implication down the road for our own security, while balancing remaining areas of exposure and vulnerabilities. So we would do this by modulating our exposure to risk along the supply chain, instead of trying to de-risk the whole supply chain. So curious to hear what you think about that, and thank you so much for your attention.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Brendan, let me turn to you if I could. You have worked extensively on looking at China's international economic relations, both in and out of government, and also its growing trade tensions globally in the context of Chinese overcapacity issues. So in 2025, what in your view will be the defining issue in Chinese international economic relations?
Thanks, Lyle. It's great to be here also. So in keeping with the theme of uncertainty you highlighted, the big uncertainty heading into 2025, of course, is new tariffs from the incoming Trump administration. So it's hard to say much with much confidence there. Otherwise, other than that, they could have a significant impact. There'll be some whiplash, plenty of attention on it. I'd emphasize, though, as a somewhat more predictable issue, that China's industrial overcapacity remains an equal, if not more significant challenge to the global economy and trading system in the coming years, and one that we'll see play out next year with many of China's other trading partners. In the face of the anticipated U.S. tariffs, we've seen initial indications of China seeking to position itself as globally as a more reliable economic partner and supporter of free trade. I think that was China's leadership today and yesterday with heads of the IMF and World Bank and other institutions in Beijing. I would emphasize the key threat, of course, from the Trump tariffs, especially if they're applied more broadly, is reducing U.S. imports from other countries. And China has little interest in absorbing those imports and replacing U.S. demand. And China's broad-based trade surpluses are already causing significant trade tensions globally. So China's overall trade surplus is likely to hit a record high of over $1 trillion this year. China's manufactured goods surplus it reached a stunning 10% of GDP, over $1.8 trillion the last couple of years. This is really coming out of the pandemic amid a very weak Chinese demand. So we heard a great discussion on the earlier economy panel on China's recent policy turn. In the spirit of open discussion and debate, while I agree there may be some consolidation, some more attention on the issue, I don't see that really meaningfully addressing the overcapacity problem at a macro level yet. And also, it seems even if we've kind of stabilized some of the downsides of the economy, unlikely to see a significant boost to imports, and no real serious move towards economic rebalancing. So the policies driving China's overcapacity are here to stay, and a weakening RMB, if that's one response to tariffs, would only exacerbate some of those trade imbalances China has. So as part of that backlash, the U.S. announced its own tariffs on several Chinese sectors facing overcapacity earlier this year. I'd emphasize that the brunt of the problem, even in the absence of new Trump tariffs, will fall on other major economies, though, starting with the EU. And also appreciating the comments from Lizzie and Michael earlier. We saw the EU finalize its EV tariffs in October, despite resistance from some member states. And I know Philippe will speak to the EU-China relations later. I would just say that it's hard for me to see any alternative but to escalating EU-China trade tensions and also EU trade restrictions in the coming year, unless the EU is willing to absorb significantly, more of China's trade surpluses and lose whole industries in EU countries. So in addition to the EV tariffs, the European Commission has several counter-subsidy investigations underway, which should come to fruition next year at a minimum. And an equally notable shift is China's exports to developing economies, which by some analyses, exceeded 50% of their exports last year. That shift looks set to continue, spurring larger trade deficits with additional emerging markets. And we've seen trade actions taken by Brazil, Turkey, India, ASEAN, among others. So these are likely to continue next year. The primary solution, as Lizzie alluded to, from both the Chinese authorities and Chinese companies in response to some of these tensions is offering FDI in those economies, particularly in some of the clean energy sectors that China dominates. And that is understandably welcomed by those economies, can help their green energy transitions, and we should see more of that in 2025. That said, that hasn't been sufficient to tame these tensions. So basically, more investment is not an alternative to China actually buying the exports of some of these economies. So Turkey moved forward with its EV tariffs on China, despite sort of promises of BYD investment there. The public campaigns by South Africa, the China-Africa Summit this fall, were notable, calling for China to actually buy more of its exports. And even in a place like Thailand, some of the Chinese investment there is displacing local production and has some cost benefits. So lastly, there's been some media reporting that China could offer a unilateral trade opening to contrast with U.S. tariffs. China has in fact eliminated tariffs on the lowest, sort of low-income countries, the poorest economies, even though that is probably unlikely to have much practical impact. And in my view, China has shown itself unwilling or unable to really do any market opening in response to other trading partners, including the EU in recent years. So it's hard for me to see much follow-through on that. So just in sum, even though we'll see a lot of attention on Trump tariffs next year, I wouldn't lose sight of the growing trade tensions China has with other partners.
Fantastic, thank you. Hopefully we'll have time to come back to the econ and trade part. We're going to move on to security and regional actors and how China has been responding. So, Sungmin, I noticed and read with great interest your recent co-authored article in Foreign Affairs titled "China Should Be Worried About North Korea: How to Make Beijing a Partner in Restraining Pyongyang." I found that title and the article fascinating, and I'd like you to expand on that. So my question to you is, how does China and Chinese analysts view the security situation on the Korean Peninsula, and how do they view the deployment of North Korean troops to Ukraine in particular?
Yep, thank you. Let me start with, so every publication has some background behind scene story. And then the story about my Foreign Affairs article was that, so when I submit the draft to the Foreign Affairs, on the same day, the news broke that North Korea sent its troops to Ukraine. So that was surprising, and then fortunately, the editorial team of the Foreign Affairs, they liked the draft, but asked me to update with this shocking news. So it is an evidence that the surprising nature of North Korea foreign policy and its impact on China-North Korea relations. So Lyle, when you invite me to speak on this panel, so I was writing an outline about my speech about, again, North Korea's surprising nature of their foreign policy. When I just finished my draft, our own president announced martial law. So there was a totally another surprise. So there was another, Korean Peninsula never failed to surprise us. So that leads to my central argument. In 2024, Korean Peninsula will be the area that Beijing and Washington will spend more time than actually the situation in Taiwan Strait. So I'll go over the China, North Korea, South Korea relations in 2024 and how they are likely to change in next year. So let me start with China's relationship with South Korea. And then to understand China-South Korea relationship, it is useful to see that as part of China-US relationship. And then we know that Beijing has been interested in stabilizing, if not really enhancing, but stabilizing US-China relationship, as we have seen the increase of the high-ranking official meeting, including the summit in San Francisco in last year in November. So as part of that, China was willing to stabilize China-South Korea relationship as well by holding China, Japan, South Korea trilateral summit after five-year suspension. And also on the same day when Vladimir Putin visited Pyongyang, China and South Korea, they hold their security dialogue, which was not held for 5 years. So there was an improvement, normalization of the dialogue between Beijing and Seoul. And from Pyongyang's perspective, North Korea would not really want to see that China is moving closer to South Korea and stabilizing its relationship with the US and also European countries. So it is understandable that Pyongyang was looking for external help, and then Russia is the only available option. And then luckily, Putin also needs just North Korea's help in terms of ammunition. So they increased their cooperation, and then Pyongyang leveraged this relationship to press China, as if sending a signal that Beijing, what are you doing? Why are you playing with Washington and Seoul? So that has been the situation last year. But I think this dynamic will change once the next administration comes in. So first, I anticipate China and South Korea will be moving even closer with each other after President Trump takes office. So Chinese analysts, they are largely worried or pessimistic about U.S.-China relationship after once Trump administration comes in, as there are already, given all this possibility of trade war and then hawkish China policy from the next administration. But at the same time, they are not shy from expressing their optimism that Trump's foreign policy, if history is any guidance, Trump's foreign policy will cause friction with the US allies again, including South Korea. So they see an opportunity as well to pursue closer relationship with the US allies, including South Korea. And then second, I expect China and North Korea will also move closer. If Trump administration somehow tries to end the war in Ukraine, North Korea's strategic value to Russia will decline. Then Pyongyang needs to extract economic and diplomatic concession from Washington, and then Trump administration will be willing to strike a deal with North Korea to negotiate a de facto arms control deal. And for China, China will not really allow North Korea to pass Beijing directly talking with Washington without Beijing's blessing. So, and also in the middle of the US-China strategic competition, China will bring in North Korea closer to its orbit again, so there will be a restoring of the strategic partnership between China and South Korea. So both South Korea and North Korea are likely to move closer to China in 2025. Finally, let me address the implication of South Korea's domestic politics for Chinese diplomacy. So the aftermath of martial law has left the South Korean politics in turmoil. All the defense minister is already arrested, and all the commander of special forces, they are under investigation, and the morale is really destroyed for this moment. So it is a prime opportunity for North Korea to conduct any provocation if they want, although I don't think they plan to do so. But the problem is that there will be a temptation for Kim Jong-un to do something to make use of this situation. The problem is that if anyone follows South Korea's military operation, South Korea's military doctrine has changed it very offensive over the last 7 to 10 years. So now South Korea's military operation has this plan to preemptive strike and also retaliatory strike. So if Kim Jong-un makes any mistake, unlike in 2010, South Korea will respond in advance and after being attacked. So we really wish Kim Jong-un would not make mistake seeing what's happening in South Korea now, and that need also increase China's value because China has an influence over Pyongyang or can deliver, has a strategic communication channel with Pyongyang. So when South Korea needs China's help in warning North Korea, that means China's growing influence over Korean Peninsula again. So that's how I see what's going to happen in 2025.
Great, thank you so much. Philippe, let me turn to you for the view from Paris and EU. You've been following China's relations with European countries for a long time now. So given the US elections of Donald Trump, do you think we can expect a, quote, European shift towards China? And if so, what would be the criteria for such a shift or a change? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lyle. I think Lizzie said EU is walking on a tightrope, so it's a good description. But this is a tale of a relationship that was described, the EU-China relationship was described by the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, as a dialogue of the deaf. On one hand, you have a China that is keen to develop relations with Europe, and has been claiming so for many years. Both on trade, on global issues. We heard about climate earlier, people-to-people, diplomacy, Africa, joint projects, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, you have a serious drawback on the European side. And our colleague Andrew Chubb earlier went through his wonderful work on public opinion. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Europe is the area where public opinion is the most negative on China. And of course, the reasons are not so different from what Andrew described, COVID, and I would probably add the propaganda around COVID and the very counterproductive propaganda that was made over Europe. I'm thinking of countries like Italy, Greece, France, where very negative comments were made on the ways Europe was handling the pandemic. Secondly, Ukraine. My colleague just next to me mentioned the war in Ukraine, and certainly this has been for the past two and a half years. A daily, trauma for Europeans to hear about on a daily basis, and the reports we hear about China's support over the war in Ukraine have been very negative and have not contributed to an improvement in Sino-European relations. And to a certain extent, I would say the Middle East, and China's attempt to play a diplomatic role in the Middle East have also not been well received. When you think about what's happening in Syria now, for example, and China's, attempt to get close to Assad, over the past few years, and now you look what's happening to this regime. And lastly, trade and the economy, and I would say European presence in China. A French diplomat was giving me a figure the other day. They were 5 or 6 years ago, there were 60,000 French citizens in China. The number is now down to 22,000, and including Hong Kong. So I think it's, it reflects the general worsening of relations between China and the West. But, the thing is, there's no strategic competition between the EU and China. There is one between this country and China. And the way the Chinese media are reflecting the relations with Europe are fairly positive still. But on the European side, it doesn't reflect this way. And the number of tourists, there's now a free visa policy into China. Any European EU passport holder can travel to China for 1 month now, and it's going to be extended for another year or two. We haven't seen massive numbers of European tourists going into China, nor have we seen the return of Chinese tourists massively. But let me come to perhaps an issue that is of interest to everyone. That's trade, and of course, as we heard, as we know, trade imbalance has increased. And sanctions have increased or have been introduced for the first time by the European Commission on electric vehicles mainly. It's only 38% it's been done in a very European way. There was like 1 year of investigation in China. All the car manufacturers were investigated, and they come up with various trade. Now, this is not going to end up well for the European car industry because everybody assumes that even with such trade sanctions and tariffs, the European car industry is in deep trouble. We just heard that on the battery sector, a Swedish company called Northvolt has just filed for bankruptcy. This is one of the largest battery manufacturers in Europe. I'm not even talking about the solar panels, which is vastly dominated by the Chinese. Now, let me come to, your question, Lyle, on the effects of the Trump, of a new Trump administration, and of course the general view of China by European leaders. So when President Macron visited the White House, I think in 2018, he said to President Trump at the time, why don't we talk about China? Why don't we sort of address the China issue? Trump's answer was, well, I'm going to deal with China myself, but before that, I'm going to deal with the EU, which is worse than China. So that gives you an idea of how people feel about Trump. But on the other hand, it's like we're kind of used to him now, as we all are. Now, of course, the climate issue will be not have a good effect on Europe. Obviously, the fact that the US will withdraw. There is a chance, indeed, that some European voices will say, well, why don't we do more business with China? But then there's all these issues I mentioned before. And then the Ukraine war, of course, is still going on, although that may not be for very long, depending on how the new Republican administrations deal with that. But at the same time, let's remember that the Trade and Technology Council, the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, that is functioning quite well, is and addressing a number of China issues, was started during the Trump administration. So in fact, the new administration has actually engaged better with Europe than the current one. That's my understanding. Having said that, we are not particularly in good shape in Europe. I have to be very clear on that. And even though we have a more geopolitical-minded European Commission, the divide and rule strategy of China has worked pretty well, and the next few years are going to be very shaky with a weaker Germany and France. In terms of China policy, we will have to rely on the European Union rather than on individual states.
Great. Well, I feel like we're just getting warmed up, but unfortunately, I'm getting the signal that we need to wrap. So thank you all for your comments and for engaging on these topics. And please read the China 2025 report. Please give a round of applause for the panel and the panelists.